So yeah, let me tell you a little bit about what my journey to this work has been. I was teaching improv in a lot of places around the world, and was realizing that a lot of the same material was coming up over and over and over again in people's work, whether they were making stuff up or whether they were using stuff from their lives. Certain themes and archetypes and things like that were cropping up, and I felt like I didn't have a handle on how to use that material very well, and I didn't want to ruin it or damage anybody with recklessness. So I went, and I'd always been interested in mythology, so I studied comparative mythology to find different systems of ways of talking about story. And while I was there, I met a very wonderful woman who basically inspired a lot of this story stuff, where she was there celebrating her recovery from cancer, a remission in cancer, and the way she did it was by having a dream that just popped up in her head, where her cancer became a character, and she could actually dialogue with this cancer. And I thought, this is great, this is perfect, this is actually something that makes sense to me as a storyteller. And so I brought the stuff that I learned in mythological studies back to improvisation, and has affected my work ever since then. But Pat was sort of the inspiration for this part of it. And so we're all natural storytellers. We just tell stories. It's what we do. And what people have not really explained all that well is why we tell stories, right? In the same way that, why do we dream? It must have some sort of purpose, one would hope. And so we're all natural storytellers, and we don't even think about it. We just walk through our day telling each other hundreds and thousands of stories, right, without even a thought, in the same way that we walk down the street and we continue to breathe and our blood pumps and our heart goes, and we don't think about that. When stuff begins to go wrong with our bodies, we go to doctors, who then sort of analyze and diagnose and alter our bodies in the way that hopefully is beneficial to us and heals us physically in that way. And so I got the idea of like, well, why wouldn't you go to an expert storyteller when you are sick, to analyze, diagnose, and alter your story as well? So what this is really using story as a complementary form of treatment to all sorts of illnesses. I am using cancer as the example today, but it could be addiction, it could be anything. And what it's really about is going one-on-one in some cases with people to help facilitate their story and their road to recovery, and rewriting that story in the way that they want. Okay, and that's what I'm going to focus on. There are three areas that I'm sort of working on, or we're working on. One is working with doctors directly about the doctor-patient interaction as collaborative storytelling. So what we do is we often will role play with doctors, playing patients with various conditions, and then we give them notes as though we're an improvised scene. So where we felt connection with our scene partners, as was discussed in Dennis's presentation, and where we felt disconnected, where we felt like they weren't listening to us, how the scene went, right? And then what's the story that happened, and what the doctor can get from that interaction as well. The patient's story. What's the patient really telling you when they tell you your story? It's different to say, this hurts when I do this, versus going, tell me about your day and when the pain comes up in your day. Well, I'm at work and I'm doing this activity at work and I feel that pain. You get a lot more deeper information than if you just say what's wrong, right? So that's one. I'm not really going to talk about that. Two, I'm also not going to talk about, which is in palliative care, the idea of working with people who are basically going to die, and asking them, what's the story you want to leave behind, right? So much emphasis is put on this idea of, keep your hope up, and and some people, I think, do that to the very end, and in some ways they don't necessarily have the death that they want to have, or they're not they haven't left the story that they want to leave behind for their family and friends to remember them by. So using storytelling techniques to try to capture that. I'm not going to really talk about that. We can talk about it later if you like. But this idea of story as complementary form of treatment. The idea being we're natural storytellers, we do it, so what if we began to deal with our illness as though it were a character, deal with our treatment as though it were a character, and began writing stories and dialogue and play and songs and creating artwork or images that we work with artists, songwriters, singers, improvisers, storytellers as a way of bringing it out in everyone who's a natural storyteller but doesn't necessarily feel like they can tell their story, right? So, so that's what I am going to talk about. There is, well, actually I'll run the exercises first. I have an example of some of this coming up, but I want to do two exercises with you. One is, it's not always just about illness, it can be about thought process or patterns that we repeat in our lives, and stories or patterns. So let me ask you this, just think for a second, and you might not have one, it's okay, don't, fine. But think for a second, what's the story, right? Think of a myth, a movie, a book, could be even a song that keeps coming back in your life, that keeps popping up in unusual places, or popping up when all of a sudden you need it, or is the comfort food you go to, comfort story that you go to. So for instance, in my life, it's the myth of Persephone, the Greek myth of Persephone. And I don't know why, but it has popped up a number of times in my life. I've been hired to adapt it as a stage play even, things like that. Just when I think Persephone's gone forever, she pops back into my life. So think about that story, and now take it one step further, and this is where the improviser, as story expert, can help you, which is what in that story, what's that story trying to tell you, right? Why does it keep coming back to remind you of something, right? An element of it. It might not be the main plot of the story, it might be something small. It might not even be the main character. It could be a small character, right? Okay, so now, the second part of this, which is actually a show that we did, and this is not, it's not a performance thing that we're doing, we're working really one-on-one with individuals, right? But part of this we did as a show, it was called Scar Stories. So what I want you to do is think about a scar that you have, and think about where it is. Is it something that you look at every day, or is it something that you think about like it's on your back and you only see it when you're looking at your back in a mirror? Or we had one where it was on a person's head, so they only see it when it was a male when he shaves his head or gets a haircut, like a crew cut, he sees the scar. So think about that scar, and then think about what do you think about when you see that scar now? Do you go back to the incident, right? Do you go back to a way of life that you once had? Do you go back to a person, perhaps, who reminds you of that scar, right? And the idea is that the scar continues to tell the story, it continues to interact with you. It is there as a reminder. In fact, it's in a way what makes you you, right? So your body, the wounded body is the story, right? So at the end of the day, if we just looked at ourselves naked in the mirror, we could tell all kinds of stories. You know, I've got scars right here, every day, right? Think about it. Learn a valuable lesson. So that's the kind of thing that we're doing, where we're sort of working with this to actualize the story. Okay, so now I'm going to use a character. Yeah, this is Domika, there she is. Domika Parker, and I'm using this material with her permission. She's working on a book. This is one of the things I think is going to end up in the book. She is a wonderful storyteller and improviser from Portland. Some of the people here at the festival have worked with her. She's come to the Seattle Festival a number of times. She's a second generation improviser. Her parents were both improvisers. So she had it coming. She's suffering right now, this very day, with an aggressive form of cancer, and she's undergoing treatment. And I thought it would be great to, and I asked her for permission to use this. I've not worked with her personally, but as an improviser and storyteller, she's doing exactly what an improviser and storytelling could facilitate in someone who's not a performer or a storyteller, if that makes sense. But she's just doing such a great job that I really wanted to use it. I have talked to her and offered some advice and help if she wants it, but she's capable on her own. So this is one of the last images, latest images that she sent out. And she's on Facebook. If you look her up on Facebook, I think you can see some of this stuff. So anyway, at the bottom here, it says, "Cancer was very grouchy last night. Woke anxiety up, who woke me up in turn, and kept all of us up all night long. What an asshole." Right? So the guy in the Kiss Me shirt with the cigarette is Cancer. Right? The guy on your right with the eyes and his hands out, that's anxiety, and then Domika's there in the middle between them. Right? So this is her image of that moment. Right? But the nice thing about this and how the story works here is that's a great image of her Cancer. So now when she writes about her Cancer, right, as a character, this is the person that she has in mind. Right? It's not some nebulous cloud, weird thing that's happening in your body that you can't, right, control. It's this guy, right? So, and one of the impulses behind this is the notion that what if the embodied story comes from our organs and our body itself, and the mind and brain is merely the processor of the story, right? Joseph Campbell, the mythologist, said stories and myths were the lusting of the organs for each other, right? Meaning that we want to talk to each other and we're just
repeat this? I think this was a very important sentence.
Yeah.
I didn't really get it. I see some...
yeah, the lusting of the organs for each other, or yearning for the organs for each other, right? Mm. And two forms of this can be taken. One is we're giant bags of just water and organs slushing around. But if we want to get to know each other, we have to tell each other stories, right? So this yearning for connection between people leads us to the storytelling impulse. But what if, right, it is even an internal impulse within us, right? And he said one of the inspirations for him, and I'm paraphrasing, was that's what our language does. We don't say speak from the brain, right? We say speak from the heart. Right? So what if the heart is actually speaking and the brain is interpreting? Right? So what if in this dream or this image that Domika has, this is actually her Cancer? Right? I'm not going to go there because I'm not a professional and able to deal with that, but that's what I'm saying. Why do we tell stories? We tell stories to wrap our arms around these things. It's easier to wrap my arms around this character than it is Cancer that's out there. Make sense? Yeah. Okay? So then anxiety becomes a character, everything becomes a character, including chemotherapy. Right? So I want to show you, or just read you two quick examples. The first one just puts it in context, and then I'll show you another image. So this is directly from her journal. Chemo is fighting with cancer. The fight is so rambunctious, it's making me throw up. I've never felt like this before. I don't recommend it.
Can you speak a little bit slower?
Yeah, sorry. I don't recommend it. Chemo is yelling, I'm trying to save you, woman. And cancer is yelling, who's this new bitch at our party? I thought we were going to watch Netflix alone. And I, whimpering out, say, chemo, do your stuff. Cancer, you're the only bitch at this party. Then quietly I mutter, chemo, I've been wondering, can you do your stuff without hurting me so bad? I won't say this in front of cancer, but you're kind of bitchy too. Right? So here you have those characters. Now the idea is once you get these developed characters, and yeah, keep this one up, that's perfect. This is for the last story. Once we get these characters going, the idea is you can begin fictionalizing them. So you have this ongoing line where eventually chemotherapy kicks cancer's ass and cancer has to leave the party, right? And again, I'm not a medical professional to be able to talk about this, why I say it's a complementary form of treatment. In realizing that story, does it somehow help the chemotherapy aid your body, right? Through story, through this thing that we do all the time, okay? This image is related to this last one. And by the way, she didn't do the artwork. She's having a friend of hers do the artwork. So again, we could bring in visual artists, musicians, things like that, finding different ways to express these stories, okay? So, here's this one. So, yeah. So I was talking to Cancer earlier and I was like, hey bud. And Cancer was like, hey. And I was like, looks like you spread to some other places and it's a little worrisome for me. And Cancer was like, hey, remember the fable about the snake who bites the guy who just saved its life? And the guy is like, what the hell? And the snake is like, you knew I was a snake. Well, I'm that same kind of snake. So I was like, okay, I get it. You're just doing what you do. I'm a warrior though, so I have to cut your head off. And Cancer was like, I see that this metaphor is going to work out too well for me. And I said, nope, Cancer, it's not. Right? And then that's it, visualized as an image. That's Domika, as drawn by her artist friend. And that's Cancer's head, and I believe she's standing on the skulls of all of Cancer's previous victims. Right. So would this story image somehow help her in understanding and fighting her own cancer now that she can see it as a character, right? Or her chemotherapy as a character, her anxiety as a character. And in playing with those from a story standpoint, does it make any difference? Again, I don't know, but I think it does, because I think there is a reason why we tell story. And again, going back to the first thing I said, my friend Pat, who inspired this, that was the thing that really helped her. Until she could have this image of what she thought the cancer was, she was going to die because she didn't understand it. She saw it as like this weird cloud that had no face, had no nothing, versus a character who wears a kiss me shirt and smokes cigarettes, as Domika's cancer does. So where it's really a form of applying improvisation and using improvisational techniques, so all the games that have been described here, but using them on a one-on-one basis with somebody who doesn't have that expertise as a way of getting them to create and access their own story. And that's the whole process, so that's it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, in Seattle, I guess specifically, there's resistance to this kind of thing because you're working with, at least the way that I'm pursuing it, is you're creating the image and you're not interpreting. So you're not saying, here's what the image means, right? Because that's for the person who created the image, or who visualized the image or made up the story to do. So what you're doing is just helping facilitate something, which doesn't necessarily end up in a cure by itself. So there's a lot of resistance to it because of the product-oriented society in which we live in, where it's like, yeah, but it doesn't do anything. Right? And again, there's just no evidence that whether it does something or not. So I've met with a lot of doctors and tried to find someone who would pull this in for a little bit more in-depth exploration in a medical program through a hospital. And they're all kind of, wow, that's a great idea, but not here. Right? So it's been difficult, but it is changing. There is this sort of rising tide, a lot of people working with narrative medicine and storytelling. So.